Hi, folks. Welcome to another episode of Film Study. This is Ken McCusick, and we're back here for part two of the discussion of the offense against the Pittsburgh Steelers. We're going to talk a little bit about the offensive line, but we're also going to talk mostly about looking forward. What does this mean for the team as opposed to what happened in that slop fest directly? Joining me today is Gabe Ferguson, a longtime friend of the show. I'm sure you recognize him. He's at Gabe Fergie on Twitter. Gabe, thanks for joining us again.
Yeah, thanks, Ken, for having me. The offensive line is something that I think is a pretty critical component of this Ravens team. A lot of their success has come from good offensive line play. In games where the offensive line has struggled, the Ravens have struggled. So looking at this game, some of the overall stats, they let up 3 sacks, 9 pressures, 1 additional quarterback hit, and then Huntley was able to evade some pressure as well. Why don't we dive right into it? Start with Ronnie Stanley and see what you what are your takes away from Ronnie Stanley's performance in this Week 18?
I want to jump right into Stanley in a second, but I do want to say aggregate pressure rate was 46%, which is very high for this game. And you and I talked in the first part, and we do need to plug the first part and say go back and download that, because what Gabe and I really talked about was that the pass rush they'll face from other teams among the potentials of they'll play in the AFC is good from almost every team. The exception might be Miami, injured as they are right now, might not present the same sort of challenges, but most of the other teams are big pass rush teams. And the Ravens have shown that can be a big thorn in their side as far as having the problems. And I guess we should go ahead and start with Ronnie Stanley in that regard, since we're talking about him. He kind of regressed a little bit in this game, a 20-snap effort versus Alex Highsmith, who gave him a lot of trouble. He allowed 2/3 of a sack. He was beaten outside by Highsmith, forced him up into the pocket where Watt cleaned up, and Watt moved laterally off Moses. I did give Moses a portion of that sack. I could have gone all to Stanley, but I gave 2/3 of it to Stanley, 1/3 to Moses in that particular instance. Generally, a pretty decent game of pushing the rusher past the back pylon. And if you've heard this show for a while, you remember I used to talk about Ricky Wagner that way as being a guy who could get a pass rusher to the back pylon. I think that's true of Orlando Brown too, bigger guy who, when he was beaten by speed, could use his bulk and length to try and push a pass rusher down to 6 o'clock relative to the quarter instead of having him come in at 9 o'clock and hit that quarterback hard. I guess it would be 3 o'clock right on the right side, but that's something that he's been good at in the past. He was not run out of any pressures personally, which is good, because the players who did, I docked them in terms of their score, in terms of the subjective adjustments specifically. Had 2 missed blocks. One of those was lost at the line of scrimmage. 3 blocks in level 2, no pancakes. Made 1 of 2 pulls, no highlights. The 2/3 of a sack is a big deal, but also in a 20-snap game, it obviously creates a lot of volatility, and it means that the score might not mean exactly what it was, particularly if I could have given him the whole sack and it would be a whole grade level worse. But it's a C with a solid adjustment for playing a player like Highsmith. I'm actually kind of encouraged by that, the way Stanley has played this year, that he's playing some of his best football right now.
So I'd like to maybe take a moment and jump back into your comment about the ability to push the rusher past kind of the pocket. This in Stanley's career hasn't really been the way he's played left tackle. He's been a player who's very nimble on his feet for the majority of his career. He mirrors very well, has a strong kind of punch. He's been one of the best pass protectors in his career. Do you see this as a combination of the opponent, someone who's a speed rusher, and the conditions, or is it more of kind of where he is now in his career?
We have seen, I think, Stanley this year continue to be an excellent mirrorer and just be giving up all kinds of roller skatey ground going backwards. That's really been the problem, is that he's just getting bull rushed too effectively this year. I think in this game with Highsmith, it's mostly about the opponent. Highsmith is tremendously quick, uses his hands exceptionally violently. If you watch him, he's effectively practicing karate against the opposing left tackle, try to chop past him, try to get his arms swiped away. But his go-to move is the speed rush. He's not nearly as often does he go to the bull rush. It's not like we didn't see it all in this game. We did see some of it, but he definitely tries to win outside more than any other individual way. And I think that was pretty much what was going on here. And it's kind of a nice adjustment for Stanley to see some of this 12-6 blocking. added to his repertoire as an alternative to mirroring and continuing to play with heavy hands and keep your feet dancing well relative to your opponent.
Yeah. And one note that I would also make, the quarterback in this game was not Lamar Jackson. It was Tyler Huntley. Pushing an edge rusher past the pocket is often very advantageous when you have Lamar Jackson, who's able to step through that hole, buy some time, roll out, maybe scramble, maybe find a receiver downfield. Tyler Huntley may not be able to make those same types of nuanced, decisions or movements in the pocket.
That's a great point. And one of the things in Texas Hold'em comes up is players who know how to play their hands pre-flop and don't know how to play them after the flop. Don't know how to put pressure on their opponent or figure out what they're doing. Unfortunately, I fall into this latter category, that I'm not particularly good after the flop, and part of it comes from not being a particularly good reader. But that's absolutely true that Lamar Jackson, when something breaks down about the pressure and something extends about the pocket, Lamar has tremendous value that way. You made the point in the first show that long time to throw is not generally advantageous for quarterbacks. And if they have bad pocket awareness, as Tyler Huntley certifiably does, it can be disastrous for such quarterbacks. So yeah, it's a great point you're making. And I think that Lamar Jackson is probably much more likely to take advantage of a 12-6 block, and paradoxically, that's really not been the way that Stanley has blocked for Lamar most of his career. Mm-hmm. He's been good at taking the being able to feel the pressure coming from his left side. Sometimes actually feel it by having it hit him, and being able to move out of it, not being too bothered by it. But they seem to have worked well together in that regard pretty much throughout his career.
Yeah, and I do think it's a positive thing that Stanley is playing a little bit better now. I think he's been able to take advantage of the bye. Some of the games that are blowouts, maybe not have as much snaps down the stretch, and hopefully get his body back a little bit. So I'm optimistic about the play of Stanley down the stretch for us. You want to move on to John Simpson?
Sure. He had his 5th consecutive game at the D level. It's also his 6th in the last 7. And we're going to get to what that might mean coming up here. He allowed a penetration on a pull, say a pull for -2, which is exceptionally bad to allow that. It's very costly. 1.5 pressures. He was also run out of another by Huntler. Again, that's not good. PFF would probably just call that a pressure and probably gave him either 2 or 3 during the game. I gave him 1.5, not counting that was 0, the one he was run out of. He just got a subjective score docking for that. But here's the really bad one. He missed 7 blocks, and 6 of those were losses at the line of scrimmage. I think every one was to Cam Hayward directly, but he might have lost one to Keanu Benton during the game as well. But he got pretty much rolled over by Hayward in this game, and both Haywards had their good blocking games. Both the Pittsburgh Haywards. Connor Hayward, the tight end, blocked Tavius Robinson very effectively in this game. Anyway, 1 net point on 5 pulls. So here's what I'm going to come down to at the end. We'll get to the end of his grade before we talk about this, but 1 net point on 5 pulls. Your big reason why you're saying Ben Cleveland's not the right guy for us at left guard is that he is kind of lumbering in terms of his feet and not able necessarily to get going on the pulls. Do we have to change that calculus some when Simpson makes 1 of 5 points on pulls? And he's been really up and down this year. He's had good games where he's made 9 out of 11, 6 out of 7 kind of things. But he's also had some bad games like this where I think he was 1 out of 5 now twice this season. It might have been 1 out of 7 the other game that I'm thinking of. Certainly has not been consistent at it. I think we're gonna come back to the question of whether or not there's a change in the cards for Cleveland replacing Simpson in the playoffs at some point.
Yeah, and one point I would also make about the pulling, it's not as much a repertoire of the Ravens' run game as it used to be. When it was Greg Roman, I feel like it was probably almost twice as frequent. You'd have those left guard pulls. We're seeing more mobility out of Linderbaum. We're seeing more wide zone. That is a potential area where I think you might get some Cleveland issues if you're doing a lot of zone runs. That lateral mobility isn't really his strength, and if you really want to have as much multiplicity and the types of running schemes you use, and that's something that Greg Monken I think has done Wait, Monken. I'm sorry about that. Todd Monken has done getting our offensive coordinators mixed up here. Has done. I think he's used a lot of different types of run schemes. Having Simpson there might give you a little bit more versatility, but it's definitely seeing his defeats at the line of scrimmage that's a concern because if you can't win at the point of attack, that's your first kind of your first job. Do you have any? I know you take a adjustment for tackles. Do you do that for guard as well?
Oh, all 5 positions. So in this game, how I graded it was as follows. So Simpson would have been entitled to a grade up of 0.06 for Hayward, which is quite high, by the way, particularly for an interior player. If you're facing Aaron Donald, you might still get 0.09, but generally speaking, it's only an edge guy who would give you the full 0.10, which is the most I ever allocate. He didn't have anything in terms of highlights or great blocks he made down the field. He did have one highlight in the game, but not an overabundance of them such that I gave him more points on that. So I ended up giving an adjustment instead of 0.06 of 0.03 for getting run out of pressure once by Huntley in the game. So that's how that went down. His overall grade was a 75 after that 0.03, which is a D+ on my guard scale.
Okay. So we're hoping to potentially see some improvement if he stays out there in the starting lineup.
Yeah. And I think we'll come back to that at the end of the offensive line, because I think that's really the big question going forward in the playoffs. And given what happened almost 11 years ago to this day, I think it's not impossible that they're going out of this right now. When you think about it, you talk about installing a new offensive lineman on a bye week usually. Yeah. Well, guess what the Ravens have right now?
Yeah. All right. Well, let's move on to center. Tyler Linderbaum had pretty good game in this one.
Yeah, absolutely. He's only out there for 21 plays, and he's one of the guys that got off the field. Obviously a very important player, but made 21 out of 21 blocks, no other negative events, no missed blocks, which creates a very boring paragraph for the player. By the way, we put together the offensive line article, but he had 1 level 2 block, 1 out of 1 on pulls, no pancakes, no highlights. It's an A+ for the game. It does meet the minimum standard of 20 blocks for a game, but I would caution people that a PFF grade for this would probably be moderated by his reduced snaps, where I give a pure points per play type grade. And this A+ is not nearly as good, obviously, as a 65 snap A+. Yeah. It's still terrific because he did as well as he could possibly do in this game, the way I saw it. So only the third A+ by any Raven this year. We had one from McCary previously, and actually I think it might be only the second, because I think Morgan Moses, after I did the all 22 review, lost 2 blocks and came down to a 0.99. So he's only the second guy to get 100 for the year.
So with Linderbaum, one of the things the center is tasked with, and especially in pass protection, is helping out his kind of co-offensive linemen, whether it's the guards to the left or right. We saw, I think, last week against Miami, he helped out Ben Cleveland quite a bit in pass protection, sliding to his right. In this game, did you take a look at that? How often he was kind of sliding and helping Cleveland? Did that happen quite frequently? Was he tasked with his single kind of blocking against anybody? And how do you do in those situations?
He had a little bit of both. First of all, I'm trying to remember if he picked up a blitz during his time in the game, and I'll just have to look at this real quickly. It looks like while he was in the game, basically, they did run 1 7-man pressure, and they got home for a sack, and that was an unblocked number 93 going through the left C gap. So that didn't have anything to do with him. But what I noticed more is Linderbaum taking over the block, which probably means a slide to the right, but Cleveland setting it up for him, and then Cleveland looking to help Moses. And that's where the focus seemed to be for the line, was sliding to get the potential help block. And by the way, that's a real strength of Cleveland. Now, he's gone back to the right side, which is kind of his natural side that he came from Georgia. But he's always been, I mean, this is the thing I really liked about him. I had him as my number 2 guard coming out. So I had him as overrated as John Harbaugh did. Let's put it that way. And the thing I really loved about him was being able, his ability to process from inside out. He's very quick at it. And it's another paradox here is that Cleveland. I get those two confused all the time. That Cleveland is an extremely good inside out processor on pass blocking, which means he's going to be effective at picking up some of those blitz and working within a relatively confined set space between two players. Not always the greatest at handing off stunts where there's some depth challenges that can come into play, but all linemen have some trouble with that. So I don't really blame him more specifically than others. But what's been paradoxically very difficult for him is he does not seem to be quite very decisive in level 2. So last week he got into level 2 a number of times and he didn't make a lot of level 2 blocks. It was most of his misses. This week he didn't miss many blocks, only had 3 missed blocks, 2 of those losses at the line of scrimmage, one miss in level 2, and he made 2 blocks in level 2. So he made 2 out of 3 there, which is certainly, he was about 2 out of 6 last week making blocks in level 2. So good, it was an improved game from that perspective. The unfortunate thing is he allowed 2 pressures and was run out of a third by Huntley. So he'd gone almost the whole game without allowing a pressure. And we kept saying, boy, he's had such a good game. And I saw one of the PFF ball guys or whatever had just put up something saying, the quantifiable pressure stats that they have were showing he had a 90 or a 91 PFF grade. That's what it was. And I go, wow, I think we agree on this. Then he had a couple of pressures late, and I would have graded him down a little bit on that. His run grade, he did do a good job run blocking in this game, and he had what I would call just a kind of an average pass blocking game. And it was great, and it just didn't end up being great at the very end. 1-on-1 on pulls, 2 blocks in level 2, no pancakes, no highlights. He got his second consecutive B. Let me just see where he was in the B range, because that's actually important. He had a 0.84 points per play, got run out of a pressure, so I reduced his adjustment to 0.02. And that was a 0.86 for a B. So I believe that might be exactly what he scored last week. It was 0.86 after adjustment. He did have a false start last week, which was holding down his grade a little bit, but otherwise it was fantastic as a pass blocker. I think the Ravens got to be looking at this, and you hear John Harbaugh talking about it last week and saying how, Cleveland is this great story. I have to think back to, the other player who was in the doghouse in 2012 was Bryant McKinney. And he took him out of the depth broadcast, installed him at left tackle, moved Orr to right tackle because Orr had been having a lot of problems at left tackle. And Orr was a little better at right tackle. But the guy who really benefited it was McKinney, who played pretty well at left tackle, better than Orr. But it was Osemele who became an absolute stud in the postseason at left guard.
Yeah, it's an interesting question to consider. Who is your best 5 at this point? And Cleveland has been someone who has really been underwhelming, I think, up to this point. He's been given the opportunity. There was some expectation that he would, potentially take over the starting guard position this offseason. And that just seemed like it fell out of this graph very quickly. I'm a little hesitant to kind of make that change at this point. I know you mentioned, it happened in the past. We have a bye week. This is an opportunity to make that change. It just seems like, at this point in the season, the Ravens are playing so well. They have a lot of continuity in a lot of places. It is rocking the boat worth it. It's hard to say. I mentioned before some of the concerns I have with Cleveland and what he can do in the running game in terms of, how mobile he is and how that might affect some of the different schemes. But overall, though, I think you have to be very optimistic about the way he has played the past 2 weeks. And if not for a potential, if it's not going to be an impact down the stretch run in this season, for next season, and it makes you feel much better about the offensive line. Unfortunately, that it's taken this long to get to that point, but still, there's a lot of positives to take away from it.
Not unheard of that the Ravens offensive linemen haven't been good till year 4, and Ryan Jensen and Powers really he played off and on well, but he was a much better player in year 4 than he'd ever been previously to that. So I'm positive about it, but most of the reason I'm positive about it is because Harbaugh seems to have forgiven Cleveland for whatever was going wrong before, and that tells me that Harbaugh might be ready to make a change. Because usually you just don't hear about it. And there are guys who never got out of the doghouse with him. Tim Williams never got out of the doghouse and was eventually cut. In Cleveland's particular case, a lot of it, I think, was off-season conditioning, particularly showing up so freaking fat after he got married, and Harbaugh hasn't had a lot of consolation. He hasn't made a lot of concessions for that in terms of what he's done over the years, and even players like Lardarius Webb, who showed up one year and failed the conditioning test. He was upset about it. Clearly, in Cleveland's case, if you look at him. Like now, look at him in pictures on Instagram and stuff. The guy's built like a weightlifter or it's built top to bottom. He's built like an offensive tackle. He's not built like a guard at all. Yeah. Same is true of Simpson, by the way. Yeah. They're both very, squared off upper body Adonises, as opposed to the pear shaped guard that has typically done very well in the NFL. To have to be carrying a lot of their weight a little lower on their body. And I don't mean their stomach. I mean, they're really sand in the pants, and, they have large tree trunky legs and whatnot. These guys, that's not them. They're apples and not pears. And they're very trim apples right now at that.
Yeah. Well, at the very least, you have to feel pretty good about the depth at guard for the Ravens right now, as opposed to, potentially in years past where you're not quite sure where you might be going if somebody goes down. So, it's that aspect of it is, if nothing else, something that you feel some comfort with. We can move back to outside right tackle. Morgan Moses, one of my favorite players to watch week in, week out. He's had some struggles this year, and this week kind of goes with that path. Not a bad year at all. I think he's been very good. He's been consistent, but doesn't have quite the same strength or punch, I would say, with and I think he's been dealing with some injuries. What were the kind of takeaways from this week?
Yeah, he only played 28 snaps. I'm glad they got him out that early. He played a little more than Stanley did. They've got this interesting rotational play where they stagger it, so McCary and Fa'alele are never on the field at the same time. So they've been always having one of their top tackles around, and they didn't end up following that in the second half. They had some Fa'alele and McCary together, but up till now, when the games have really meant something, they had. He struggled quite a bit. One pressure, he had shares of 2 sacks. The first third, I would understand if somebody looked at it and said that's not his fault. Watt moved off him late in that play, and it was after the pocket had already been compromised by the fact that Stanley forced the quarterback to move up, yada yada. But the fact of the matter was, Moses had been backed up quite a bit, and it made it easy for Watt to get off him and clean up on that first of his sacks. And then a half share of the second one. I don't think there's really any question about that one. One level 2 block, 1 out of 1 on poles, no pancakes, no highlights. Finished a really good year on a down note with a D in this game. Now, one of the nice things about Moses is he really hasn't fallen off the score sheet in any of these games. Before I say that, or maybe after I say that, this particular case, that's 2022. I need to look at 23 here. He hasn't really had a game that I can recall where he fell off the table so much. And players like McCary, yeah, that's right. So he might have missed a D. He might have had a very highest F in one game. It looks like he has had at least a D- in every game. No, actually it was a D-. He's been at the D level 3 times. He's been at the C level 3 times. He's been at the B level 4 times, and he's been at the A level 4 times. So pretty damn good set of results, honestly. Yeah. For a tackle like that, probably been a B- overall player or a C+ in that range, and that's certainly very solid when you're talking about a inexpensive right tackle.
Yeah, and he's definitely getting a little older. If you look at his PFF grades, he's one of the most consistent players you'll see in their grading system over the past 5 years. Yeah. Just in every single column, just like he's the model of consistency. He's not going to have many weeks where he's super high. He's not going to have many weeks where he's super low. He's just he's just very consistent in his play. I think at this point he might be a little bit better in the running game than he is in the pass blocking. I do think he's had nagging I think, shoulder injury that's affected his ability in pass protection a little bit. He hasn't had quite the same punch. I mean, that's something you need at tackle. You need to be able to attack before you get attacked. He's big. He has length, but he can still get beaten every once in a while with speed. I think that if I have concern, and we talked about this a little bit, it's the tackles in the postseason. But and this isn't a great way to finish the season. So do you feel like this is kind of just like playing against a tough competition, bad conditions type thing, or do you feel like he's going to be okay? I mean, he played really well last week, from what I can recall.
Yes, he played very well last year. He did actually get an A+ for the week, so that does make 3 for the season that have occurred. So my answer is yes. That this was mostly about the opponent, and TJ Watt gives everybody trouble. And one of the things about my system is, since I limit the total amount of adjustment, if you go against a player like Watt, in particular, if you're a tackle going against the absolutely top end of the league in terms of pass rushers, the adjustment might not be enough to cover just how difficult the assignment is. That said, I think it would have been a high D instead of a low D that he got. If anybody out there, by the way, knows Morgan Moses, I really appreciate his craft as an offensive lineman. I would love to have him on this show. I would love to have an advocate out there who could forward this to Morgan Moses and say, this guy obviously watches your play very closely and really appreciates your mobility for start with and what he's brought to the team. But certain players, how much practice they're putting into their craft, and you really just love to talk to them about offensive line play, given the chance. So if you get a chance to listen to this, Morgan, if somebody's passed this along to you, at Filmstudy Ravens, my DMs are always open. I'd love to talk to you, and we'll arrange to have you on a show, even this bye week, if you have time for it.
That'd be cool.
Yeah.
I love watching. He's just, I love watching him moving and like mowing people down. It's just so much fun. For someone who's his size that can move with the nimbleness that he does, it's impressive.
You know what it is, and it's the opposite of Ben Cleveland. You see, he's very decisive with his blocks, so he knows what he's doing. Even when he's the back of the track, where he could get a courtesy point, a lot of the time, he almost always connects on those pulls, and it's because he knows how to run that track and knows where option A, option B, option C is. He conserves his momentum very well, is one thing I've liked about him. That Vontae Leach was the fullback I really associate that with much. And he's just a guy I really appreciate watching play offensive line. And you score every one of these players' blocks, and some offensive linemen, they just frustrate the hell out of you by making the same error time after time after time again. And, sometimes it's physical limitations, but a lot of times it's just stupid. And, you're really, you just run into this kind of thing and you say, how can you not have that trained out? And but Morgan Moses, I don't have that feeling at all.
All right. We got the 5 starters. Maybe we can talk a little bit briefly about the backups that came in and filled in. Patrick McCarry, he's a backup, but he's spent a lot of time and this year filling in as needed. Did I see that he played center a little bit this game? He played
6 snaps, I believe, at center. And I'm of the opinion now he can't be the Ravens' backup center during the postseason. He's too important as a backup tackle. So they really shouldn't be using him just to, I don't know, shake off some rust at center, whatever. I guess it might be wanting to get him a few shotgun snaps, maybe. Take him in practice. That's all I've got to say about it. Take him in practice. In game, it's too much of a risk relative to the potential benefit and the likelihood that he'll ever actually end up at center during a playoff game.
So I might be, having some brain farts here, but so the Ravens have Cleveland as their, Cleveland and Moses, or sorry, Cleveland and McCarry as their top 2 kind of backups, Valele as a tackle. Do they have a true backup center?
Mustafa.
Is he active every game?
No, he's not active every game, and it is a question. And if they ever had a problem with Linderbaum where they weren't sure if he was able to complete a game because of some injury, then I think they would have to deal with that. But they've got themselves in this position where if they want to go with only 3 tackles, that means they're going with 3.5 with Ben Cleveland being the reserve right tackle. Wouldn't be a good situation, but they could shuffle to it if they needed. The truth of the matter is very few NFL teams have the quality of 4 backup linemen who are each above the replacement level, I believe now, like the Ravens do. And that's it's just a remarkable advantage. Most teams have got every guy they have in that category already on the field hurting them, in some ways. But the Ravens are different. They have some backups who actually provide some value.
Okay.
Let me talk about McCary's game a little.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So Highsmith, just too quick for him. And it's not unheard of. He's also, some of the short armedness really shows up against a player like Highsmith, who's really, again, playing karate, practicing karate against the left tackle. He gave up 3.5 pressures, 1 sack. That was to Marcus Golden on the final play. Don't know how PFF scored that. They have McCary for no sacks, and I have no idea how that sack is not a PFF sack, honestly, because look at the play. I mean, just take a look. That was on the Ravens' last offensive play right before they kicked the field goal that brought them within 7. Huntley ran him out of 2 more pressures, which is exceptionally bad as well. So he could have given up 5.5 very easily, plus the sack. 2 level 2 blocks, no pulls, no pancakes, 1 highlight. An F, he got a .31 after losing his entire adjustment. So the .31 was also his raw score, which is terrible. Obviously, no amount of adjustment obviously would have fixed that. But it's 29 points short of a passing grade, which is 60 a tackle.
So you posed a question before of do the Ravens want to use him as center when he's a valuable tackle? In this game, he had a terrible game at tackle. Yep. So do you think maybe, he has played tackle at sometimes very well for the Ravens. It has been a bit up and down. If he's going up against Myles Garrett, it's not a pretty sight. I feel like he had some very bad games against some of the high end pass edge rushers because he doesn't have the physical traits that you need to kind of compete with some of those players. Do you consider, Falele, who I think has improved this year quite a bit, and we can talk about him shortly, as your number one option, or are you still just going to McCary, even though he's had some of those limitations?
At left tackle, I'm still going to McCary.
Okay.
And if you look at Stanley's play and compare that to McCary this year, McCary's outplayed Stanley at tackle. And now McCary's played some on the right, some on the left. And if I split it out and I looked at his left tackle play, it wouldn't shock me if I'd find out that's been worse, because I know he's had some really bad games over there, and he's probably played better in relief of Moses when he's been over there. But he's got a .69 raw score, which would translate into mid-level of the C range after adjustment. And Stanley's got a .60 so far on this year. So his is in the middle of the D range. It's been a very tough year for Ronnie Stanley. And part of the difference you'll see, if you go out to PFF, you'll see that Stanley looks a lot better. Part of the big problem with it is not just pressures. I'm scoring Stanley for more pressures, that's for sure, but it's penalties. And Stanley has a bunch of penalties, and PFF severely underweights penalties. I've had this philosophical discussion several times on the show. I thought maybe we could get into it on the show, but I think we're running a little bit behind. We take some time this off season, maybe sometime, to go through the methodology and talk about it.
Okay, well then let's just move right on to Daniel and talk about his role in this game.
Yeah, he outplayed Moses in this one. He had 28 snaps, facing primarily Watt, but Watt, of course, went out of the game, and then Falele got time against others. 1 pressure, 1/2 of penetration. Not bad at all for that level of competition. Huntley did run him out of a 2nd pressure, so that weighed on his score a little bit. 0 level 2 blocks, no pulls, 1 pancake, 1 highlight, 2 blocks at the line of scrimmage on that 1 highlight play. So it wasn't the most common type of highlight is what I call a highlight combination block, where he'll tee up one guy at the line of scrimmage very effectively for the guy next to him, and then go into level 2 and make a block. That's probably the most common type of highlight I see. But in the case of Stanley and Falele in this game, it's often 2 blocks made at the line of scrimmage, where Stanley in particular, very effective, knowing how to get one guy out of the play and then also catch somebody else on the backside of a run play very effectively. And even as his physical talents have waned some, that intelligence to play left tackle is still all there for Ronnie, and so it's at least good to see he can take advantage of that when he has the opportunity. In Falele, there's no doubt about him remaining around for 2024. He's I think he's answered the bell these last 4 games where he's had 92 total snaps. Got a C in this game, by the way. 92 total snaps at a C level, which I think is for him is such a big step forward, even though it's only a game and a half. It's a big deal. And to frame this up, he did 4 previous career games where he'd received a score by having 20 plus snaps, all of them at Fs. So this game and a half at a C level is a big freaking deal, and it's a big freaking deal for this crossroads of his career that he's at. So I think he'll go in. He'll be one of the really important players to watch in the preseason and camp. See if he's punching any better than he is now. That's really that's probably the area of greatest possible gain for Daniel Falele, is making use of his outstanding size by developing some physicality in his arms and additional violence there.
Yeah, I think there's definitely room for growth for him. He has a lot of the kind of rare physical traits of someone.
If you found $100 bill on the ground, you wouldn't walk past it. So don't pass up a chance at easy cash with MyBookie. MyBookie has the biggest online selection of odds and contests to fill all your sports betting needs, anytime, anywhere. So you can turn that sports knowledge into cash in your wallet. Bet on the NFL, college bowl games, or play for your share of big cash prizes in the weekly blackjack tournaments. And if you've been waiting for the right time to get in on the action, that time is now. Make your winning move today. Sign up at MyBookie and use the promo code RAVENS to claim your deposit match, redeemable up to $1,000. Again, that's promo code RAVENS to claim your bonus. Experience the thrill of sports betting right from the comfort of your home. Bet anything, anytime, anywhere with MyBookie.
To play, offensive tackle, he's massive. A lot of the players who have been his size haven't really excelled, and there's reasons for that. It's difficult to play that big, but if you can actually put it together, it can be, a real benefit. I am curious about this rotation that the Ravens have been doing in recent weeks. It seems like it's actually worked out really well. It's given the players, Moses and Stanley some rest, some time to not put as much strain on their bodies. That's given, guys like Makari and Falele meaningful reps. They've been part of the plan. They've been part of the offensive line continuity, and they seem to have really stepped up in those positions as well. So I think it's a kind of a great success.
Yeah, I would completely agree. McCary has played well in aggregate for the previous 4 games prior to Pittsburgh. I'd have to see if this really holds up over the 5-week period with the game being this badly. But it looks like he scored 61 points in 96 plays. That's not really that good, but it's not so fall off the table. It's in the 60s, right? 63.5. Probably be over the last 5 games put together, even with this horrible game that he just had, he's still in the high D range. And given what's out there at this time of year for offensive tackles, there is no one who could give the Ravens what McCary has done for them in general for the season.
Yeah, and that's the reason why they gave him the contract extension that they gave him, because of what he's able to do and the versatility as well. So I guess rounding out the offensive line play, Mustafa mentioned him briefly earlier. Kind of want to go over his stats a little bit.
He played 3 snaps at guard, replacing Simpson, and he gave up half a sack at guard, so that he did not have a good score there. And then he went to center, and he played pretty well. He played almost pretty much a full half of football. Might not have quite played the first drive of that, but he played many more snaps at center. Gave up 1 quarterback hit where he was backed up by Hayward, but otherwise didn't have any other negative plays. 4 level 2 blocks, 1 on 1 on pulls, 1 pancake, 2 highlight combination blocks. And as I would break this game down, he got about a B at center, and if you add in his half a sack at guard, he drops to the DF border overall because he didn't have a whole lot of snaps total in the game. And let me bring that up for a second and so his total snaps for the game. This is not right. we transferred this information wrong, so I can't because I've got him for 9 snaps, but I know that's not correct. So anyway, yeah, I just have this incorrect. I apologize for that. And then Salah, I did want to mention before we talk about him. He sat out despite being active for the game, and that's happened now twice to him this year. And I guess I'd ask you: is that a guy you would have liked to see some, or is it a case of if he's not ready, he's not ready?
I think it's more the latter. And if it's going to be in any game, it's going to be this game where it doesn't matter. You can kind of see what he has to offer. But if he's not ready, then that's it. And I don't think the Ravens drafted him thinking he was going to be a major player for them this year. It's more of a developmental player. Obviously, they've kept him on the roster this long, so they see something in him. He has good size. He has decent athletic traits. They gave him opportunity in the preseason, and he didn't do well. So I think they said, okay, you're just going to sit and learn. And, similar to what they've done with Falele, he had to play a little bit as required. You haven't had to do that with Salah. Hopefully, he progresses his body a little bit. He learns the system, learns some of the things that you learn as a professional, and can actually come out and be someone who competes for an actual spot on the roster next year.
I mean, you are limited in terms of the number of developmental offensive linemen you can have carry on the roster. You just can't carry 5 of them.
Yeah.
And the fact that Salah and Falele have both kind of fallen into that category this year, and Falele's been serviceable enough to play here at the end of the season reasonably well, is a very important thing. We don't have that data point yet for Salah, and in fact, the fact that he's been was terrible in the preseason, been active twice, hasn't seen any snaps, is kind of telling me he's not there yet. They probably would have figured a way to try and get him in the game on Saturday had he been close to ready.
Yeah. Okay. Jumping back to Mustafa real quick, PFF has him at 32 snaps total.
32 is what I have. And so I'll just give you that reason. I forgot I had the paper copy that's not the spreadsheet copy, but he had 32 snaps and he got 29 blocks on those and a total of 23 points. So while he had a .90 adjusted and a B at center, his negative 2 points at guard on 3 snaps bring him down into that borderline DF range.
Yeah, I mean that could be from a scientific perspective, a sample size thing. 3 snaps at guard. One of them is really bad. It's going to be a bad grade at guard. Obviously, played better at center. And that could be a place where the Ravens want a more constant type of backup in years moving forward. So I agree with your sentiment. Someone bring back, see what he has. Could be a useful piece to have around.
Is he a game day? I mean, we talked about this, I guess, already. You have 8 offensive linemen on a game day. You just can't fit any more than that on your roster reasonably. If you have 8 on game day, can you make room for Mustafa if you have the situation with McCary and Fa'alele both being carried as backup tackles? Do you have to somehow sit Fa'alele for some games, accept the fact that Ben Cleveland is your emergency tackle, and have only McCary as your active player, and then you're carrying one other guard, I guess, as a backup, who would be, you'd be carrying one other guard as a backup. You'd be carrying Mustafa, McCary, and who am I not thinking of? Well, Cleveland's in it would be Cleveland because Cleveland's in the game this week, but it would be Zeitler normally. That's what it would be.
Yeah. So I think I still keep Falele, Cleveland, and McCary as my backups, because I think you can lean into that McCary center, in a pinch, and have Falele play tackle if you have to have both of those happen. I mean, that's obviously a nightmare situation, but the flexibility of McCary allows you to do that. I think I would want to have Falele out there as well, because I think he can offer you some things, in jumbo packages. There's some added benefits to having a player like him, and the way he's playing a tackle, I'd rather have that. And it's just for me.
So you go without having a backup center, and you just hope nothing goes wrong.
A true backup. Yeah.
And maybe you let somebody else take a few snaps then. One of your guards has to know how to do it, whether that's Cleveland or I think they actually let Ben Powers try it last year, and it was a disaster. And they just shut it down right away in the first practice that they were working on it. All right, well, let's move on. We do want to spend a whole lot of time on this game, but we do need to talk about some other skill position players and then get to some of your mailbag questions. You're the guest. Who would you like to talk about first?
I'm going to talk about Isaiah Likely. And I'm going to talk about him because he's been someone who's seen such a role increase. And it's been due to injury, but not just in terms of, the impact he's had, but I feel like the trust level with him and Lamar Jackson from the beginning of the season, where he was on this field a lot, but he was never targeted. He was barely used. He was blocking mostly, and he was kind of like a guy who was just there for the most part, going through the motions, to someone who's actually become an integral part of the offense. And I just think it's so commendable to him, to Jackson, to Monken, getting him involved and really seeing the offense not really lose anything, frankly. And that's saying a lot because Mark Andrews is such a good player, but they still had a lot of really impressive, flow through the offense, through their tight end. He's made a lot of big plays for the Ravens. And maybe he doesn't get the targets that Andrews has commanded in the past, but he still is making the most out of those targets. I saw a stat, it might have been Sarah who put it out there about EPA per play or EPA per catch at the tight end position. And Isaiah Likely is lapping the field. Like he is doing exceptionally well.
Not surprising.
When he's targeted and when he's catching the ball, he's picking up yards after the catch. We saw him do that in this game. He's scored the Ravens' only touchdown, running through tackles, extending the ball, getting into the end zone. He seems to have a nose for doing that. He's just been a joy to watch. And it's a breakout that the Ravens needed to have happen, and he stepped up in a big way.
Yeah, huge breakout. One of several on offense the Ravens have had during this season. Keaton Mitchell being another one that we didn't expect, and all of a sudden, he's pretty much looking like the MVP of the team, other than Lamar, in terms of the offense. But if you look at Likely, since Andrews has been out 6 games, he's had 28 targets for 322 yards. That's 11.5 per target. That is such rarefied air. I have to put it in perspective. No Raven has ever had over 11.04 in a full season, and that was Andrews in his rookie year. We're getting up there in terms of number of targets. That this is a very significant number. In fact, I don't have his number for the year sitting right in front of me, but he's got 411 yards right now. How many targets is that over? 411 and 40. So he's now up at 10.25 or a little bit higher for the season in terms of that. And that's only been exceeded a handful of time by Ravens receivers. When you get up to 40 targets looking at it, I think it might be only 4 times it's been done previously. Wow. So this is a great season by Isaiah Likely. It's not just a great 6 games. It's a level where almost no Ravens receiver has been.
Well, the remarkable thing about it is, it hasn't only been 6 games if you look at the net, but that's where the spike has been.
Yes. Yeah.
What he's done in this small, stretch of games has been exceptionally good. Even averaged out over an entire season where he was a little bit, lagging behind to start things off.
Yeah. He went, people don't remember. I mean, he went 4 consecutive weeks after that drop against Indianapolis, a really critical drop, one of about 5 plays in that game that would have won the Ravens the game. He had 4 games without a target.
Yeah.
He finally had a catch again against Arizona, 101 for 10. Then he was 4 out of 4 for 42 against Seattle. And it seems like they're going to integrate him again. And then he has 1 catch against Cleveland, goes 0 for 2 against Cincinnati before Andrews gets hurt and they go on the 6-game run. It's been a really wild ride for Likely this year. I guess one of the things that I keep getting asked about is the room for both Likely and Andrews in this offense.
It's interesting because if you look back earlier in the season and last year, they were on the field together, but they weren't utilized. It was always Andrews when they were. I mean, there might have been a couple plays where Likely would be kind of, someone who would get the ball in certain situations. But when they've both been out there, it really hasn't been a traditional 2 tight end offense where both tight ends are part of the offense in terms of passing attack. What we've seen in the Ravens in the past, they've had a couple of seasons where they've gone a lot of two heavy sets and they've had both of them active. We haven't seen that so far this year. It's really been one dominant pass catcher from the tight end position. So it will be interesting to see how that's utilized. The Ravens have been a lot more, three wide receivers on the field than in years past, obviously, with Todd Monken taking over. But is Likely and Andrews, are they two of your best four receivers? I say potentially yes. I think you'll rotate them in and out, but I think they can definitely both be utilized, and they're both weapons over in the intermediate routes. And they can do different things on the field as well. Likely can stretch the field maybe a little bit more. Andrews can also stretch the field. They can be used different ways. Likely is good yards after a catch. I really like the potential of it, and it's something I'm very curious to see what happens.
And if the fact that they could be on the field some is a really good thing, because Andrews does take a lot of snaps, but the Andrews we're going to see coming back is probably going to be a reduced pitch count Andrews. And if that's the case, then there's probably room for both of them in the offense in terms of running a fresh tight end on the field every play, or if you want to do it, or for 3 plays at a time kind of thing. So you have that ability. I think there is some legitimate question of whether or not both of these guys, who seem to work better as flex tight ends, will work well together in 12 personnel, where you're really trying to get the ball to a tight end. It just may not fit in the same way, but it has the best chance to work if each of them is expecting to play about 65% of the time, and there's only an overlap of relatively few snaps. Because Charlie Kolar's out there and he's having to take whatever mop-up duty is available right now, and that will probably largely go away when Andrews returns.
Yeah, and I think we'll probably see a little bit of a reduced role for Patrick Ricard. It's not going to be a major reduction, but he has kind of upticked, the snaps he's taken as more of a blocking type tight end inline position. And he's been good. He's been very good in that role. So I don't want to say like we need to see less of him, but just having, 2 true pass catchers on the field that aren't bad blockers. They are more kind of like flex players, Andrews and Likely, in terms of, the ability to play out of the slot. But they're not negative players, I would say, in the blocking ability. They're not like dominant Gronkowski type players, but they're not going to like to be completely like zeros out there either. So I think you do have some options in terms of what you can do. You can spread out teams even in 12 personnel and run the ball. I think that gives you some opportunities with the back like Justice Hill or even Gus Edwards. And it leaves a lot of opportunity, I think, for what they want to do.
Now, we talked a lot about Hill and Edwards and their importance to the offense in the first part of the show in particular, so I don't really feel the need to talk about him here, particularly in terms of this game, but we know Hill is very important to the offense. I think the one question I have in terms of personal production here is, did Melvin Gordon really play himself out of a job with the fumble? I'm actually very surprised by the Dalvin Cook signing. Doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense to me. He was a fast player at one point, and a guy who could provide some of the things even that a player like Hill might do. Supposedly, able to give you some good cutback ability and good power, contact balance and whatnot. But he hasn't done anything for the Jets this year, and Breece Hall has. So kind of the notion that nobody can run behind that lousy Jets offensive line, I think got shattered a little bit by Breece Hall's success there.
Yeah, I had to agree. And, Dalvin Cook also, he had some moments last year when he was still at the Vikings, but he was a little bit on the regression side in terms of some of the stats he looked at, yards after contact, some of the advanced metrics. He looked pretty pedestrian in a lot of areas. He does still have some explosive ability. I think, he can potentially, and if he gets into open space, if it's well blocked, I think he can pick up some chunky yardage for you. So I don't want to completely write him off. I think if I have to choose between Melvin Gordon and Dalvin Cook, I'd probably lean Dalvin Cook, even though I haven't really seen him in this offense. I don't know what to expect out of him. I just think he's a better back at this point in his career. And that's more saying probably about Melvin Gordon not really operating very much, in my opinion, than it does about Dalvin Cook. But I think they brought him for a reason. It could just be, having some depth there Essentially, if somebody gets hurt, you need to have an option, someone who's a professional who's been around the league for a long time. But I just don't think Melvin Gordon offers very much at this point in his career.
I'm right there with you, and we kind of always have said if the fumbles return, then his value is going to drop off the table. Dalvin Cook's only a year removed now from being a guy who produced roughly 5,000 yards rushing over the previous 4 seasons. Yeah. He was 1159 or higher each of the 4 years. He was a good yards after contact runner with the Vikings. So I don't think that's been the problem. He's been terrible with the Jets this year, just one of the worst in the entire league. And obviously you're probably getting hit a lot further into the backfield by larger men when you're trying to run behind that New York Jets offensive line. But it is what it is. And it just nothing would really shock me at this point, other than I really don't see Dalvin Cook being a guy who ends up getting 12 carries in one of these playoff games.
That would be a bad thing, I think. And only due to somebody being hurt, which I'm hoping doesn't happen, because the 2 players that the Ravens have had all year, Hill and Edwards, have been very, very good for them. I think they're going to ride those 2 for the majority of the running back touches.
Yep, completely agree. How about we go on and move on to some questions here? Unless there's another player you're just itching to talk about here.
I mean, not really. This game was pretty underwhelming from a skill position player. Not really much to talk about. And the ones that play in this game are probably going to have major roles. Aside from Justice Hill and Edwards in the playoffs. Okay.
If you would switch over to Twitter, if you can get there and look at hashtag Filmstudy Mailbag, and we'll kind of each bring up a question, and you can either ask it as a question or start to answer it yourself. But we have some interesting questions here. The questions, by the way, have been fantastic recently, and we're going to expand them to be on Friday Morning GM. So if you have questions for Friday Morning GM, stick them in hashtag Filmstudy, mail them, and just label them as a Friday Morning GM question in some way, if you can, for us, and we'll be adding them there. Okay, this is a defense question. I want to wait on that one. Okay, well, here's one from Brad McGowan. Here's a good one. He says, Stanley appeared on the Lounge podcast last week and shared that while dealing with his injuries has been tough, he still believes his 2019 form is reachable. Given what we've seen veteran linemen play themselves back into form, and given we've seen top LT play in their mid-30s, Whitworth, Trent Williams, and given Stanley seems to be stabilizing some after a tough early stretch, what are your thoughts on possibly extending him at this point? Okay, that's also a Voss question. It seems like I'll leave the extension question to Voss. Let's talk just in terms of what this means. I think I can draw one positive from it, that Stanley is positive about potentially having a career that goes beyond this year, and that he's not personally seriously entertaining retirement at this point. I think that is a big positive to draw from that statement if it's all true.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing. He has obviously dealt with a lot of injuries over the past few years. It's got to be difficult for a player, especially someone who's at the top of his game before he got hurt, to have to fight through so many things. Obviously, playing through pain at some points in the past season, this season included, it's good to know that he feels like he's kind of on the upswing. He has, I think, gotten a little bit better as he's allowed to heal a little bit. I do think it's definitely his body that's kind of failing him on that end. And if there is room for him to kind of get back stronger and healthier, it's a positive for sure. And if you don't want to talk about the future, that's fine. I would just say these possible extension would have to be at a team-friendly price. It would have to make sense for the Ravens cap situation in the next couple of years. That's the only thing. Like, you can't extend him at the same price tag. It would have to be a little bit of a haircut.
I think the reason an extension would get done would be for the Dennis Pitta reason, that it gives him a chance to stay with the team when the Ravens are ready to cut him. I don't see them tacking on, 2 more years and then a bunch of void years or whatever it might be. They could do that because they might want to figure out a way to kick some money down the road and have him compete again. I guess I'll say this about Ronnie. All athletes get to a point in their career where they can't do it anymore, and they're forced to consider retirement in various ways. It happens to every sport, every athlete. Father Time's undefeated, et cetera, et cetera. The only guys who get away from that are people who literally die before they have to reach that point. Obviously, no one wants that. So in Stanley's case, I don't know. I think he has been very in touch with what his body can do for him during this time, and it hasn't worked out for him. But I don't know how much he can realistically assess himself in terms of how much he can get to be the same player. I still think it's positive that he's thinking about how he can return to 2019 form. I just think, he's going to have to work like hell to return to the form he was when he came back in 22, I guess it was, right? So he didn't play for most of 21, and then 22 he played, and he was below the 2019 level, but better than he's been in 23. I think that might be a realistic goal.
All right. There's a question here I'd like to bring up from Randy Morgan.
Okay.
He asked, do you think this offense is better built to handle a bad weather game, like the 2020 game in Buffalo, than perhaps in previous years? This is something that I've talked with Jordan Coe about on air in the past, or in podcast form, about the Ravens' kind of tendency to really play poorly in bad weather. It tracks through a lot of games. It's not something that's just like one or two games. It's pretty consistent. And I do think that this year they might be a little bit better prepared for that. One, because I think this is the best passing offense the Ravens have had in quite a while, maybe ever. 2019, statistically they were very good, probably a little bit better, but this year I think they're more dynamic. And I think that actually, while when you're in bad weather, you think, okay, you want to be able to run the ball, but I think actually the opposite is true. You need to be efficient passing the ball in order to not become one-dimensional. And in the past, I feel like the Ravens have been one-dimensional, and that has taken away their strength, even when they are good at running the ball, because teams can take that away and it makes it much harder to move it.
I completely agree with that logic. I think that has been the problem with the Ravens in the past. Even in the Titans playoff game, part of the issue there was wind. And, one of the things that I was just really concerned about is anything that potentially takes away the big advantage you have at quarterback, like wind, is not something the team with the better quarterback wants. It's also not something the team with the better kicker wants, by the way. You don't want to be put in a position where your advantage is mitigated by the elements. And I think you've hit it right on the nail right on the head when you say that if teams that can play the Ravens heavy horizontally up front are teams that tend to succeed in taking the run away from pretty easily, honestly. And it's funny because the Ravens have run on all kinds of teams that have, generally speaking, good run defense, but that's because that good run defense is being done not against these incredible zone read leverage reader like Lamar Jackson. It's being done against normal kind of handoff in either the power game or a zone scheme or whatever it may be that doesn't depend heavily on the quarterback. I think the more you depend on that, and the more they can crowd the line of scrimmage and truly assign guys away from the passing game to instead watch Lamar Jackson, the more a running game suffers. And I think you nailed it. Let me come up with another one here. I had one. Ken, maybe I'm reading too much into this, but I noticed Linderbaum's interview after receiving news on making the Pro Bowl. I noticed he didn't mention anything about coaching related to his success. And even Ronnie Stanley's interview with Mink seemed similar. Well, okay, that's from Stogie Yogi. I think it's Isaiah, right? He's given questions before, usually good ones. This time, I really wouldn't read that into it too much. I don't know how much that interview was edited. I don't know what they're leaving out. I think players do really respect Joe D. And by the way, that respect can come in different forms. And you probably, if you're out there and you're a professional, you've probably had a boss that was a little weird in some way, but you still, and maybe even he was overbearing in some way, but you still really respected his judgment when it came to certain points. I think that's where a lot of linemen might feel that the old school nature of Joe D's coaching maybe isn't exactly what they need anymore, or they don't think so. But they still realize the value in it for maybe some young linemen. So a player like Linderbaum, who's now a veteran, and a player like Stanley, who certainly is a veteran, may not get the same value from Joe D, and it may not be the first thing that comes to mind, but I bet they really valued what they got from Joe D over the course of their career.
Yeah, I think it's hard to put ourselves in that position to see like what the relationships are like in the locker room and in the meeting rooms. Um, Jody has been a coach for a very long time, I think he has proven that when given the opportunity, players seem to come out of the Ravens better. Like they've gone better. The offensive lineman, it's a consistent progression we see. Sometimes it takes a while to get there, but I think there's certainly some types of whether it's repetitions or some sort of the paces he's putting them through, or some of the mental ways he's ingraining into them. It's working out really well, and I think he's a very good coach.
I don't think there's any coach that we had one more. Cole Phillip, who says, does the Melvin Gordon fumble open the door for Cook to take RB3 responsibilities? I think we've kind of already answered that during this show, and both of us feel it's a pretty substantial possibility at this point.
I think so for sure. It's more of like, what's worse? Like, what do you think you have, or the potential of something that you don't know how bad it could be? Melvin Gordon, he's had one or two good plays for the Ravens this year. He's also had some negative plays. The fumble, obviously, being major negative. Can you really trust him? I know it was bad conditions, so it's like, Gus Edwards also fumbled. He's fumbled 2 weeks in a row. Are you going to bench Gus Edwards? No. Mm-hmm. Melvin Gordon isn't the player Gus Edwards is. He doesn't have a key role. And if there's a risk of him who has a track record of fumbling in his career, it's something that you have to really, I think, have in the back of your mind. And what is the upside of having him out there in the first place? I think Cook probably has more upside.
Alvin C. and others, I appreciate your questions. We'll get to some of those on the Friday morning GM show, particularly one about Jeremy Lucien, because I want to talk through a couple angles about that. But a simple answer is, if the Ravens have activated for him for this game, it would not have started the clock on his NFL career. So it would have been one where he would have still been a year one player next year with 4 years with the Ravens still remaining. So anyway, he'd have to get 6 games active. And the chance going into this postseason, by the way, that Lucien is going to be activated at some point with all the injuries they've had now at safety, including Worley going to IR, it ain't zero. It's not zero. They could pick up somebody else potentially. I think it's pretty close to the point where they would activate him, particularly if the need is really a back end free safety type role.
Question about that, because one of the kind of under the radar moves that maybe not everybody noticed was Ardarius Washington coming back from IR. He's someone who's seen kind of safety, although more so cornerback. He's kind of been more of a slot player than like a true safety, but he adds another dimension there too. And it'll be interesting to see what opportunity he's given if need be, because he's someone who basically came out as a starter with the Ravens defense at the start of the year.
Earned
after the injury. Yeah, and he played extremely well. And he's played well when given the opportunity. So I'm interested to see if he's someone who's out there for the Ravens in the playoffs. Yeah,
great point. And I think he'd be certainly ahead of Lucien, and probably even ahead of Lucien in terms of taking a backup safety role. Now he was not active for this game, and he's still in his window to be activated. Yeah. There is a chance that he doesn't even make it by the end of the window, that he doesn't progress enough with how he's moving forward, and he's not ready. The last couple they've done have been kind of prophylactic in nature. So bringing Pepe back was like that, and they did have the need for him. They happened to have an injury at the right time. Malik Ham, they didn't have an injury at the right time, so they basically just let it pass. And he reverted to IR for the season, and the Ravens did not lose the IR DTR spot. So it's actually, I'm sorry, they did lose the IR DTR spot, but they had a surplus of them. Now I believe they have 2 left for effectively 3 players, is how I understand this, that they have to make some choices between. And one of them is JAD coming back, which I don't think is high on their priority list, obviously. Mark Andrews coming back, and who's the third? I don't believe it's Worley. Would it be Duvernay? Is there
Duvernay?
Yes,
back?
Duvernay. Yeah. Duvernay is the other guy. So I mean, Duvernay at this point, boy, he'd help the Ravens, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, they could use the wide receiver depth. Obviously, when he's on his game as a kick returner, he's one of the best in the league. They have gotten good returns, in his absence with Wallace and Hill, so you can't complain too much about that. But if he's fully healthy, I think he's definitely a weapon in the Ravens team.
The one thing you didn't mention is he was a great gadget guy last year, particularly in the wins over Cincinnati, and the team is potentially so short on that having one more speed guy be really a big deal. I think we're going to see the Ravens really focus on speed in the way that Miami has this offseason. I mean, they may draft for it. They may actually use a draft pick to get a guy who's a pure speed lottery ticket. But the use of a priority free agent money on Keaton Mitchell was a huge payoff this year, even for the 47 carries he had, honestly.
Do you think that speed position is more valuable in the Ravens at wide receiver or running back?
I'll take some of each, but I think that they definitely absolutely need to have a speed running back. And I think you could do other things with a speed running back, and the Dolphins do it with Achane by putting him out as a flanker. You can have pony looks where one is split and one's in the backfield. You can have pony looks where they're both in the backfield. So you have a lot of options.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And they already have speed at wide receiver. Zay Flowers, Rashad Bateman, they're very fast.
Yeah, very good. All right, outstanding. Always so much fun to sit down and be able to talk football. We said this would go short, and of course we went a little long. We apologize for that. Gabe, such a pleasure though. Tell people where they can find your work online and talk football with you.
Yeah, Twitter's the best way to get in touch. I'm always on there. Willing to chat about Ravens football. At Gabe Fergie. I've been a Ravens fan for a very long time. I know the team well. I know NFL well. So definitely willing to chop it up there.
All right. Other folks out there, if you'd like to be on a film study short, hit me up. DMs are always open on Twitter. I want to hear from you for all the reasons that you've heard a million times from me in the past. If you want to do something nice for the show, I'm not a Patreon guy. I may have to find a way to charge for content in the future. But for right now, the best thing you can do to support the show is to tell somebody else about it. Word of mouth. Show an older person how to use it directly off their computer is what I always tell people, because I think that would have been valuable for me personally to go, oh, you just go to filmstudybaltimore.com, go to podcast, and you click right on it. You can listen to it there if you're not familiar downloading podcasts to your phone. And the other thing you can do if you have a moment, write us a 50-word review. That's usually the limit on these kind of things. And 5 stars if you would, and put it out there on any of the major podcast things. It'd be a big favor. Anyway, Gabe, thanks very much for coming on.
Yeah, again, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure as always.
We'll talk to you next time on Film Study.